Get the youths that come up from the gully. No TikTok on the streets, them we study. I count up the cash, tell me if you know.
This is the first national television interview for Angela Davis since she was acquitted of kidnapping, murder, and conspiracy in connection with the Marin County Courthouse shootout that took place 2 years ago. This will be a first-hand account from Angela of the events of the last 22 months and her plans for the future. Sister Davis, let me welcome you to Black Journal, and let me speak for literally millions of people who are very pleased and happy with your safety. Tell me, the events that I guess you're now reading in the newspapers, do they corroborate with the actual accounting of the events that you know best?
Well, there's been a great deal of distortion in the vast majority of newspaper accounts, television accounts, press in general. And I think that the kind of publicity that the establishment press is willing to give me is simply based on the fact that they think that I'm good copy. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I didn't rush to answer all of the requests that have come in for TV interviews and radio interviews and newspaper interviews. I felt that, however, that appearing on Black Journal was something that was extremely important, because I know that you are interested in serving the needs and interests of Black people. And therefore, I decided to do this one because I feel that this is a chance for me to express my gratitude and appreciation to all of my sisters and brothers who've worked so hard and so long in the struggle to free me.
Angela, in terms of the sisters and brothers who have worked for your freedom, could you put in context how the activities of those people actually ended up in your being vindicated of those charges?
Well, there have been all kinds of activities over the last 22 months. But perhaps I can give one very concrete example of the way in which the involvement of large masses of people, and particularly Black people, had a direct impact on the case itself. A couple of months ago, there was a decision from the California Supreme Court abolishing the death penalty. That meant at that time that we were able to make a motion for bail. There were felony defendants all over the state of California who also made motions for bail. But as it turned out, I was the only one who was immediately released, and I suppose you know that afterwards the Supreme Court modified its original decision and stated that cases that had been capital offenses, that were capital offenses before the abolition of the death penalty, would continue to remain unbailable. But right after the decision came down, letters and telegrams and telephone calls and petitions and all kinds of things came in from all over the country and all over the world. And in fact, during the presentation of the bail motion itself, the judge acknowledged the fact that he was receiving so many telegrams and letters that he didn't have time to read them. Right. And I know that that had an impact on the decision. What it meant was that the judge could release me on bail, knowing that there existed a climate of public opinion which would agree with that, and he wouldn't feel isolated. So I think that that had a very important impact, and that had an important impact on the outcome of the trial. Because how would the jurors have felt if they saw me coming in from a holding cell underneath the courtroom, flanked by guards and matrons? They would tend to look at me as already guilty, as already convicted. Now,
that's what really happens to most Black people.
Oh, yeah.
When they come in a courtroom, they're chained. Right. I've seen pictures of some of the Soledad brothers as they were chained and led into the courtroom. Angela, how do you feel inside now? I mean, about being free. Do you have a mixed feeling about being a little bitter and a little sweet? Are you most sweet? I mean, how are you accepting this, one, this ordeal that you've been put through, and secondly, now your new freedom?
Well, certainly the months I spent in jail, the majority of which was spent in solitary confinement, weren't a very happy experience at all. But I wouldn't really say that I feel bitter about my own personal ordeal, because I know that so many of my sisters and brothers are right now suffering under conditions that are far worse than those that I had to put up while I was in prison. My overall feeling about the acquittal is that the victory around my case means that there can be more victories. And all of the people, all of the sisters and brothers who came together in an organized fashion in order to demand my freedom can see now that it's possible to free more political prisoners and to do something about the oppression which has enslaved black people in this country for so long.
Well, Angela, when you say political prisoner, what do you mean?
Well, there are a number of ways in which I would describe what a political prisoner is. Of course, we all recognize that the United States does not recognize the existence of political prisoners. And in fact, in general, when you talk about a person who is arrested for political reasons, you're talking about the use of criminal charges in order to stifle leadership, in order to isolate leaders and activists from the community. There is that kind of political prisoner. We know about Bobby Seale and Erica Huggins and Huey Newton and Leotis Johnson, and I could go on and on and on. The list is endless. The Soledad brothers. We know that they were arrested on criminal charges as an excuse for removing them from the community, removing them from their revolutionary work and activity among the people. But over the last few years, there has come into being another kind of political prisoner. And I'm talking about all of the sisters and brothers who are victims of the system, who are easy targets of the police, who get railroaded through the courts into prison, often for no reason at all, who are there only because they're black. And I think a brother during the Attica Rebellion sort of expressed this whole thing when he was asked by a reporter what he was charged with. And he said he was charged with being black. That's why he was there. And coupled with the oppression that leads black people and brown people, people of color, into the jails and prisons of this country, has been a new kind of political awareness that has spread all over the jails and prisons throughout the country. When George Jackson, and Fleeta Drumgo, and John Clouchet, and Ruchell McGee, I could go on and on and on to name the sisters and brothers who have achieved a political awareness and a political commitment behind the walls. But you see, once they do this, then they are subjected to all of the terror that the prison system has to offer. Mm-hmm. And so they end up spending years and years and years in prison under the worst of circumstances.
Angela, tell me how, I have been frequently asked this, we've received letters, fans of Angela Davis, and some brothers and sisters don't understand your concept of communism. They don't understand, they cannot, let's say, reconcile blackness and communism. What is your philosophy in that respect?
Well, first of all, I think that black people, particularly black youth and brown youth, are beginning to see through the lies and distortions of the government and are beginning to see that much of what has been said about communism in this country is simply not true. The reason I am a communist is because I feel that only through a total revolution, which is going to overthrow the capitalist control of the economy, which will seize the wealth from all of the giant corporations that exploit and control the lives of all working people, but particularly black people. And see, I feel that the reason why racism is so blatant and has been a part of the history of black people from the time we were first kidnapped from the shores of Africa is because it has helped those capitalists gain more and more profit. And if you look at any factory, any plant, who does the worst jobs? Who gets paid the smallest salaries? It's black people. So racism serves as a buttress, as a justification for super exploitation. And I feel that if we're going to talk about the total liberation of black people, we first have to liberate ourselves from the material conditions of our oppression. And the material conditions of our oppression are no jobs, or bad jobs, unemployment, bad housing, bad medical care, and all of the kinds of things that will be eradicated under socialism. I think, however, that there's been a lot of confusion, even in the movement, even among sisters and brothers who are fighting for liberation about what communism is all about. People have talked about black people being used by communists. And I think that really underestimates our ability as black people to be leaders. And not only to lead ourselves, but to lead white people also. And as a communist in this country, I see that the greatest revolutionary potential exists among black and brown people.
Angela, let me ask the classic question.
And so just one more thing, and I'd like to make the point that when I talk about a communist revolution, I'm talking about a revolution which encompasses the vast majority of people in this country who are working people, but a revolution which is led by people of color, working people of color.
Would you see this as a means of, one, eradicating racism as well as classism?
The two are inextricably combined. As I said before, racism, in terms of its material base, means super exploitation economically. It means that black people get the worst of the entire lot economically. It also means that the capitalist, the boss, is able to divide black workers from white workers. Why? Because he tells the white worker that his problem is not those who control his lives, those who take his labor and turn it into profit for themselves, but his problem is the black man who's trying to get his job. And so racism is operated as a divisive force to prevent the emergence of a real revolution in this country.
Well, the kind of thing that you're trying to do, Angela, do you see that as being in any way in conflict with black nationalism?
Well, it depends on what you mean by black nationalism. Of course, I would never equate the oppression of black people in this country with the exploitation of white people. I think that there is an essential difference, and there is a national aspect of our struggle as black people, and we have to maintain that cohesiveness and that unity among ourselves in order to be effective in a broader revolution. I would say also that for white people, for white workers, the most important thing they have to do now is combat racism, so that racism and the fight against racism becomes the key to a broad revolution embracing all people in this country, all working people.
Angela, when you say revolution, when you say overthrow of the government, number one, what do you mean by revolution? Do you mean an armed confrontation? Do you mean a change in the values of the system? When you say overthrow of the government, again, are you speaking in terms of violent confrontation? Are you speaking in terms of political process? What is it that you have in mind when you...
Well, I mean, that depends really on those who wield the power. If it were possible to have a peaceful revolution, and when I say revolution, I'm talking about a complete and total change in the entire fabric of this society, a change in the distribution of wealth. We have to seize all of the wealth from the General Motors and from the Fords and from all of the giant corporations that control the destiny of this country today. But we also have to revamp the educational system. We have to revamp all of the political institutions. Now, if those who are in power now would simply accept the demands of the revolution, then there would be no necessity for violence. If there is violence in the process of waging a revolution, that will be determined by the ruling class. That will be determined by those who hold power. Now see, let me just give you a small sort of a microcosmic example of what I mean. Say a group of people get together and go out and demonstrate in order to dramatize their demands around a particular issue. That's fine if they are able to do this in the way in which they want to. But what happens in many cases, you have police forces unleashed on them because they are peacefully demonstrated. And my position is that we do not stand there and allow ourselves to be shot down and beaten. We have the right, we have the human right to defend ourselves and to defend our principles and defend what we want to do. And so I would say that in the event of violence in a revolution, you always have to see that in the context of defending gains of the people. We have a right to defend those gains.
Angela, now many people, black nationalist organizations, middle-of-the-road organizations, black people, are talking about using the political process. Some blacks in the community have now gotten behind McGovern, some behind Humphrey, some behind Shirley Chisholm. Do you see politics as a viable force in our struggle? Do you plan to become involved in the political process of getting people elected to effect change?
You mean the electoral process?
Yes.
Because there are many different levels of political struggle. Well, I think that the electoral process is something that should be utilized. It's not something that should be seen as the solution, because I don't think that simply by changing the faces and changing the figures in the government, there's going to be any kind of fundamental change. When we talk about a revolution, we're talking about a fundamental change in the system, a complete and total overthrowing and transformation of the system. I feel that the electoral process is significant in the sense that it serves to measure the level of consciousness which black people and people of color and white people as well have achieved. Take someone like Ron Dellums. The fact that Ron Dellums was elected to Congress said something about the collective mood of the people in his area. And precisely because it said something about their collective mood, he cannot forget that he has a responsibility to make known the needs and the interests and whatever his contingency feels are the important issues of the day.
Angela, to draw an analogy in another direction, many people are saying that, some institutions, particularly white press, that the fact that you've been vindicated of the charges proves that the system of justice will work for black people. The fact that you were found innocent by an all-white jury in only 13 hours of deliberation and only 13 weeks of a trial proves that the system can work.
You know, I suppose they must feel that we are totally unsophisticated. At first, I really found it incredible that they could do this again. They did it after the acquittal of the New York 21. They did it after Bobby and Erica, and now they're doing it again. But, see, it seems to me that the very fact that they're so quick to jump up and say, here's another acquittal. It now demonstrates conclusively that there's nothing wrong with the American system of justice. If they weren't aware of all of the problems in the judicial system, of the way in which it has been historically used and continues to be used as a weapon of oppression against black people, they wouldn't be so defensive about the whole thing. How can you say that this demonstrates that there is justice in the American courts when we know that the jails and prisons across the country are filled to the brim with black and brown people? We know that on death row right now, the vast majority of the prisoners who are going to be executed are people of color. We know that when a black person is picked up from the community and brought to jail, he's going to have to depend on a public defender, because more than likely he won't be able to hire a good lawyer. And this public defender, what is he going to do? He's going to tell him to cop a plea, even though he knows in many cases that his client is just as innocent as he is. It just doesn't make any sense at all. And then just one more thing. I am convinced that if there had not been the kind of struggle that occurred around my case, that I probably wouldn't be out here now.
In other words, if you had not been Angela Davis.
Well, not Angela Davis, but
well, I mean the well-known.
See, this whole victory, it's not my victory. It's our victory. It's a victory of all those who struggled around me, not because I happen to be a special kind of a person, but because I am also, like all of our sisters and brothers in the jails and prisons, a victim of the government's repression. And so what I'm going to try to do now is to build the very same kind of movement that was built around me, and the kind of movement that liberated me from prison in order to free more of our brothers and sisters, because that's the real significance of this victory.
Speaking of your plans, and our time is short and I'd like to get some quick questions. Speaking of your plans, one, do you plan to go to Tanzania and teach at the university there?
Well, I have been told that such an invitation is forthcoming, and I am, of course, very tempted to take it. I really haven't made any definite plans about that. However, I would say that no matter how tempted I might feel as an individual to go to another country where life is more beautiful, in a country which doesn't have all of the oppression and all of the misery that we see here, I feel a very special kind of responsibility to stay here and help to build a movement that's going to bring about some change for my people in this country.
Speaking of other countries, it's also rumored in the white press that you are now going to Bulgaria and to Russia for vacation.
Well, there are all kinds of rumors. It's true that I did receive an invitation to visit the Soviet Union. I don't know where the rumor that I was going to Bulgaria stemmed from. But as I said before, I'm planning for the time being to remain in this country and help to do some of the work to build the kind of movement that we're talking about. Of course, in sometime in the future, I probably will spend some time abroad, because I feel that I have to also express my appreciation and gratitude to all of the millions of people in Africa and in Europe and in the socialist countries. When I was in jail both in Marin County and Palo Alto, I'd get each day huge mail bags full of letters from the socialist countries, and they waged a really tremendous campaign. Cuba, they had a committee there, and they just went all out in my defense. And also, I feel that in expressing my gratitude to the people in countries abroad, I also have the responsibility to help maintain the momentum of the movement that was forged around me so that we can also break some more chains and tear down some more walls.
Angela, you're a philosophy professor and a philosopher. I think sometimes philosophers use terms that they assume that lay people understand. One of the terms I think has become confusing is the statement that you were in love with George Jackson. Now, did you mean that? Well, how did you mean that?
Well, of course, as I love all my people, I also love George Jackson. But then I had a special kind of relationship with George as a result of working on his defense on the outside and getting to know him as a person. And then once I was arrested, becoming closer to him because of the similarity of our conditions. The prosecution's theory of the case, of course, was that I was ruled by
emotions,
a passionate love for George. And my response to that was very simple. And I think a lot of it had to do with the male supremacist notions and ideas. He felt that because I was a woman, he was going to be able to pull this off. I mean, I was just completely floored when I heard that, because what he was really saying was that to love someone is a crime.
And that secondly, following your theory, to be a woman meant that if you did, you would be out of control by your emotions.
Yeah, that I would have absolutely no ability to be rational and to make decisions of my own.
Angela, our time is short. I'd like to get a very important question in, because I'm sure you'd like the public to know how you feel. What about your parents, your mother and your father, during this last 2 years?
Well, of course, the last 2 years have been a very difficult time for my parents, particularly because they live in the South and because of all of the pressures that they've had to withstand. But they've really been beautiful, extremely beautiful, because instead of succumbing to all of these pressures, they became stronger. And my entire family was involved in the defense. My mother spent a great deal of time speaking across the country, as did my sister and my brother, who is a football player and got a lot of pressures from that end. And I think that out of this, this whole ordeal, there has developed an even greater solidarity among us, but it's a solidarity which has developed through struggle. That's the most important thing.
Angela, I have to say this on behalf of our viewers, that once again, you look well, and we're happy to have you out in minimum. And we're very pleased that you're back with us. And as your plans unfold, we want to be kept abreast of them. And I'd like to thank you so very much for being on Black Journal.
Well, Angela, we're going to wrap a little while about a number of things, but I guess one of the most important things that we can start off talking about is the fact that you have been called a revolutionary, a militant. Much of the media has pictured you this way. It's talked about all over the world. What do you see as the meaning of the term revolutionary?
Well, there's no single simple meaning of the term revolutionary. A revolutionary is a man or a woman who is a lot of things, but basically the revolutionary wants to change the nature of society in a way to promote a world where the needs and interests of the people are responded to. A revolutionary realizes, however, that in order to create a world where human beings can live and love and be healthy and create, you have to completely revolutionize the entire fabric of society. You have to overturn the economic structure where you have a few individuals who are in possession of the vast majority of the wealth in this country that's been produced by the majority of the people, and you have to destroy this political apparatus which, under the guise of revolutionary government, perpetrates the most incredible misery on the masses of people.
One of the interesting things about the term revolutionary is the fact that people, so many people, see it in the context of violence, that revolutionary means violence. Violence every day, every minute, at any given time, no matter what the circumstances. How do you view this in the context of violence?
Well, of course, that's part and parcel of the same attempt to separate and isolate revolutionaries from the people. Of course, revolution does not mean violence in the sense that that's its defining characteristic.
Yet there are those who see it that way.
Well, yeah, and that's done in a very conscious manner to mislead people and to lead people to, for instance, equate a progressive socialist revolution with fascism. During the time that I was out in the streets and speaking throughout California, I found it incredible how many people define socialism or communism as if it were the Third Reich.
Yeah.
Certainly, of course, though, in the history of revolutions, and not only socialist revolutions, but bourgeois democratic revolutions also, the American Revolution, for instance, you have had the occurrence of violence as a means of seizing power from the oppressor. But why?
Yeah.
This is because the oppressors have failed to acknowledge the fact that the people were right and that the people had the right to control their lives and to control their destinies. And they are the ones who always initiate the violence. If people are serious about moving ahead to create a better society, then of course they should not allow themselves to be deterred simply because a few people at the top, who are in possession usually of monopoly on violence, decide that they're going to unleash all of their forces of oppression to stop them.
We may now be in only the initial period of an era of change, as far-reaching in its consequences as the American Revolution, that we are witnessing throughout this country and throughout the world a major uprising of women. In the 21st century, and we're already 2 decades into the 21st century. I can remember when 1984 represented the future. But in this 21st century, we have finally begun to recognize the leadership of women. Social movements like Black Lives Matter are led by women, Black women and queer women. There are more women in Congress now than ever before, including the first Palestinian American woman elected to the House of Representatives. We have finally begun to acknowledge the centrality of what were once marginalized as women's issues, and thus not worthy of general consideration. And so this morning, I want to talk about the various connections between racist violence and gender violence. And I want to begin by recalling that my very first childhood memories are the explosive sounds of racist bombings of a house across the street from where my family lived. And in my memory, I also recall a late night knock on our front door by a woman who was fleeing a man whom I later found out had raped her. In elementary school, I remember whispered conversations about a classmate and friend who had been the target of sexual assault. And I distinctly remember questioning in my own mind why she was assumed to be responsible for that act of sexual violence. Some years later, Emmett Till was lynched because of a putatively sexualized comment to a white woman in the town of Money, Mississippi. And in 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed, claiming the lives of 4 beautiful black girls who were just beginning to explore the possibilities of their lives. The movement against gender violence in this country is frequently periodized in connection with the 1966 founding of the National Organization of Women and the creation within NOW of a task force on rape. I certainly do not want to minimize the important work that NOW has done over the years, and I don't want to undermine the importance of the eventual emergence of an anti-rape and anti-violence movement that reflected the work that women associated with organizations like NOW perform. But I want to trouble the way we think about the emergence of the movement against gender violence. You might say, I want to trouble that genealogy. With genealogies, one always chooses a point that is established as the beginning. And oftentimes it's rather arbitrary. If one looks at the genealogy of the anti-violence movement, one can question why the work against sexual violence associated with the civil rights movement, the Southern Black Freedom Movement, came to be so marginalized that it took many years of research and activism to recognize that Rosa Parks was one of the pioneers of that work. And of course, Rosa Parks is recognized as a great figure in the history of this country, but largely only for refusing to move when she was told to move to the back of the bus. And as the legend would have it, she was very tired that day. When she was alive, she made the point that she was not tired at all. And she also liked to say that she was represented as a tired old woman who didn't feel like getting up. She says, I definitely wasn't tired, and I was not old. She was in her 40s, early 40s. Now, I want to say a few words about Rosa Parks. She was involved in the 1930s in the movement to free the Scottsboro Nine. Are you familiar with the case of the Scottsboro Nine? Interestingly, my mother was also involved in that campaign, and I learned about it when I was very young. But these were 9 young black men who were fraudulently charged with raping a white woman. There's a lot of literature available on it if you're interested in pursuing it further. But she was one of the major, she and her husband were major activists, and they had to raise money in secret at that time. She remembers that, quote, "Black men could not hold meetings without fear of bodily injury and death." Now, later, when a carload of white men in a town called Abbeville, Alabama, gang raped a black woman by the name of Reese Taylor, the NAACP sent Rosa Parks. She was one of the leaders of the NAACP in Montgomery. She was sent to investigate that act and to help build a movement. And it's interesting that this was probably the first campaign of its sort. It was characterized by the Chicago Defender as the strongest campaign for equal justice in a decade. And what's interesting is that the Montgomery Improvement Association, which became the organization responsible for coordinating the 1955 boycott in Montgomery, grew out of that effort. But the question I'd like you to ask is why we don't see the relevance of that work to struggles against gender violence more broadly. And why were white women anti-rape activists reluctant to acknowledge how important it might have been early on to cultivate a political consciousness that linked rape to racism? In this context, I would like to share with you a passage from written in 1972, from a letter written in 1972 by Anne Braden, who was a white anti-racist activist in the South, and one of my own mentors. In 1972, she wrote a letter to white Southern women. It was in connection with the case of a young man by the name of Thomas Wansley, who had been, like the Scottsboro Nine, several decades before, who had been fraudulently, falsely charged with rape. Anne Braden always envisioned a strong and powerful multiracial women's movement. And she wrote, "We haven't been able to develop that kind of strength because of the deep chasm that divides white women from black in our society. A chasm created by crimes committed in the name of white womanhood. It may seem paradoxical," she wrote, "but in this racist society, we who are white will overcome our oppression as women only when we reject once and for all the privileges conferred on us by our white skin." For the privileges are not real. They are a device through which we are kept under control. We can make a beginning toward building a really strong women's movement as we openly reject and fight racist myths that have kept us divided. We can begin by joining with our Black sisters in a campaign to free Thomas Wansley and go on from there to free others and ourselves. As many scholars and activists have pointed out, existing social hierarchies have determined who gets to be a legitimate survivor of gender violence, who gets to represent those who constitute legitimate victims. Beth Ritchie, who is a scholar, activist, a sociologist, has written about the every woman. The every woman who peoples our imaginaries when we think about the possible eruption of gender violence. And she has pointed out that this every woman is actually a racialized construction. Racialized as white. Why is it so difficult to posit Black women, women of color, as exemplary? And this is a question that Tarana Burke asks. And as you know, she was the original creator of Me Too, but who gets credit for it? So my questions are about the connections we make. The experiences of women of color are rich and generative, but why are they considered experiences that relate only to communities of color? Perhaps if it had not been assumed that we had to work with the most general of categories, and perhaps if racist categories were not already presumed to be general or internalized within a presumption of generality, we might have recognized the value of holding on to the specific and the particular. I think this is the lesson that the Black Lives Matter movement has been trying to impart a century and a half after this insight should have become a part of our history. And when I say that, I'm referring to the fact that there have been many controversies surrounding the slogan Black Lives Matter. And as you know, there have been many who've said that we shouldn't say Black Lives Matter, we should say, exactly, all lives matter. As if all lives matter is in opposition to Black Lives Matter. And as if we are denied the opportunity to recognize that democracy in this country is based on the presumption of a few standing in for the many. All people are created equal, but who's really created equal? Perhaps one can say all men are created equal, because we know that women were excluded from the very beginning, right? But then we know that not all men were included, so perhaps we could say, well, all white men are created equal, but then we know that the reference is not even to all white men. It actually is only to affluent white men. So from the very beginning, our presumptions of generality that are inscribed in the Constitution actually refer to a very small minority. But on the other hand, we all know that if ever Black lives were to truly matter in the world, that would be a sign that finally all lives matter. And so we should question why white is the subject of generalization and universalization. Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian American always remain at the level of the particular, that which is not helpful in the production of the category women. But why do we assume, moreover, that disabled women are to be treated as a marginalized category? Especially when we're speaking about violence. Disabled women have a 40% greater risk of intimate violence, as the American Psychological Association has pointed out, especially with severe consequences than their non-disabled sisters. Why are trans women especially if they are Black trans women or trans women of color, why are they always dismissed and demeaned? Why can we not recognize that if we want to eradicate gender violence from our worlds, we have to address the conditions surrounding those who are most subject to violence? Intimate violence, stranger violence, economic violence, state violence. The Human Rights Campaign, which advocates for justice for LGBTQ communities, recently released a report entitled A National Epidemic, Fatal Anti-Transgender Violence in America in 1918. The overwhelming majority of trans women killed were women of color. I mentioned a book earlier by Beth Ritchie, the sociologist, and the title of that book is Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and America's Prison Nation. Her research points to the pitfalls of assuming that the figure of the middle class, cis, heterosexual white woman should stand in for all targets of gender violence. On the other hand, if one looks at Black women, Black trans women, there are insights to be garnered that would otherwise be unavailable. I have been involved for many years in campaigns against the state violence that we know as imprisonment, campaigns against the prison, and not reformist campaigns, but abolitionist campaigns. And I frequently point out how our work was enhanced by the contributions of trans prisoners who asked us to begin to address questions of the rights of trans people in prison. And out of that work came insights, not only regarding physical, psychological violence, but also ideological and epistemic violence. And we came to recognize that the prison, among the work that it does, it presumably works as a punishment apparatus, but it is also an apparatus that ideologically produces and reproduces the gender binary. Of course, there are men's prisons, right? And then there are women's prisons, and we take that for granted. But what happens to those who don't necessarily identify in a straightforward way with that gender binary? Prisons are gendering apparatuses. Prisons are gendering apparatuses.
These moments in history that have been completely rendered invisible, and now, of course, in Europe and in the U.S., all over the global north, we're seeing the reverberations of the impact of slavery and colonization. And I'm convinced that we will move forward.
How should America deal with the extraordinary problem of incarceration, especially amongst the African American population?
Well, of course, some of us have been addressing this issue for decades, since there were perhaps 200,000 people behind bars. Today, the U.S. has the largest incarcerated population in the world. 25% of the planet's population in prisons. Women in prison in the U.S. constitute almost one third of all women in the world who are behind bars. So there's clearly a problem. Finally, there's been some recognition within the U.S., even among the right wing, who've created this formation called the right on crime. But I think the problem is that the assumption remains that prisons can be reformed. If one looks at the history of the prison system, there is a pendulum that swings from reform to incapacitation, from back to reform. So we're in a period now where people are demanding reform. The problem is that reforms have often rendered the institution itself more permanent and ultimately more repressive, more racist. So those of us who've been engaging with this question for a long time, many of us have come to the conclusion that the system itself needs to be abolished. So we call ourselves, instead of reformists, we call ourselves abolitionists.
So how do you deal with criminals?
Well, you see, the problem is that prisons cannot even deal with crimes. The vast majority of people who are in prison, the more than 2 million people behind bars in the U.S., are not criminals per se. They may have committed property offenses. They may be in prison because they've never had the opportunity to get an education, because of illiteracy, because of poverty, because of lack of housing, because of mental health issues. The 3 largest mental health facilities in the U.S. are county jails in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. So the question of what to do with people who really commit horrendous acts of violence is, first of all, a relatively small one, but second of all, not even taken seriously by the fact that they're simply shipped off to prison, and we never have an opportunity to ask, how do we get rid of these horrible acts of violence? How do we purge our societies of violence against women, gender violence, violence against trans people? How do we address the fact that people who live in violent relationships as children can ultimately replicate that violence? So we need a different kind of justice. We need a form of justice that's not retributive, that does not meet violence with violence, but that seriously asks questions about how to make relationships among human beings more productive.
Is there any place on planet Earth, on planet reality, that is invented, that has come up with the system you describe?
Well, one can see promises in indigenous communities and restorative justice practices, transformative justice practices. One can see the promise of a different idea of justice. But if you're asking about a developed justice system in the global north, I would say no, we cannot see this. And this is precisely the reason why we need to allow our imagination to lead us in a direction that may mean that we want something that has never actually existed in the world before.
I like that. Good note to end on.
Send me off, go and feed. Know me and a rat, but me I go there for the cheese. Do that up on my back, and you know them off for eat. So don't test me kill your blood clean. Yeah, hear me? Send me off, go and feed. Know me and a rat, but me I go there for the cheese. Do that up on my back, and you know them off for eat. So don't test me kill your blood clean. From the gully, get the youths I come up from the gully. Don't take talk on the streets, them we study. I count up the cash, tell mum if you not worry. I pray a different part and I chat it in a hurry from the gully. Get the youths I come up from the gully. Don't take talk on the streets, them we study. I count up the cash, tell mum if you not worry. I pray a different part and I chat it in a hurry. It started that first Christmas, ain't really get shit I asked for. My wish list was feeling typed down. So bro, she said they hit